The politics of temple control in India, what Modi government really told the Supreme Court. Part 1. The statement that created confusion. In recent years, one of the most emotionally charged debates in India has revolved around the question of temple control. The issue sits at the intersection of religion, constitutional law, political messaging, federalism, economics, and civilizational identity. When the government of India recently informed the Supreme Court of India that it doesn't support government control over temples, many people interpreted the statement as a historical ideological shift. Some believe the Indian state was finally preparing to completely withdraw from temple administration. Others assumed that state government would now be legally forced to surrender control over Hindu religious institutions. But neither assumption reflects the actual structure of power in India. The reality is considerably more complex and far more strategic. The statement made by the Union government was not a declaration of immediate institutional withdrawal. It was a carefully calibrated constitutional position delivered inside a legal context. The government was essentially trying to achieve two goals simultaneously. First, it wanted to appear supportive of religious autonomy and Hindu institutional independence. Second, it wanted to preserve the constitutional authority to regulate what Indian law calls the secular aspects of religious institutions. This distinction between religious and secular function lies at the heart of entire controversy. To understand what is actually happening, one must first understand how temple control evolved in India, why governments entered temple administration in the first place, and why the issue has now become politically explosive. The modern Indian state inherited many administrative frameworks from the British colonial system. During colonial rule, British initially adopted During the colonial rule, the British initially avoided deep involvement in religious institutions but eventually began regulating temple revenues, lands, and endowments, especially when corruption allegations, succession disputes, or financial conflicts emerged. Over time, the logic of administrative supervision became institutionalized. After independence, several Indian states continued and expanded these systems through legislations. As a result, many major temples today are not fully autonomous religious bodies in the way many people assume. Instead, they operate under state created administrative frameworks. In states such as Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, and others, governments exercise varying degrees of influence over temple finances, appointments, boards, lands, donations, and management systems. Some temples are directly administered through departments like the Hindu Religious and Charitable Endowment System, while others operate through state regulated devasvam, devasvam boards or statutory authorities. This created a long running grievance among many Hindus who argued that the Indian state disproportionately interferes in Hindu institutions while allowing other religious communities greater institutional autonomy. Over time, this grievance evolved from a legal issue into a political narrative. The argument increasingly became civilizational rather than merely administrative. Critics of temple controls began framing the issue not as a question of efficiency but a question of religious sovereignty and state neutrality. This is the environment in which the Modi government statement emerged. However, the key detail most people missed is that the Union government didn't argue that governments have no constitutional authority over temples. In fact, the government reaffirmed the long standing constitutional doctrine that while religious affairs deserve protection, secular activities associated with religious institutions can be still regulated by the Indian state. This distinction is rooted in the Indian constitution itself, especially Article 25 and Article 26. Article 25 guarantees freedom of religion, while Article 26 grants religious denominations the right to manage their own religious affairs. But these protections are not absolute. The Constitution also permits state intervention in matters connected to public order, morality, health, and secular administration. Over decades, Indian courts developed a doctrine separating essential religious practices from secular administration. Once something is categorized as secular administration rather than pure religious practice, the state acquires room to intervene. This is where the entire debate becomes politically fascinating. Because if one examines the actual mechanism of control, the so called secular aspects include almost everything that gives institutions operational power: financial management, land ownership, appointment systems, administrative structures, revenue flows, audit mechanisms, trust governance, employee oversight, infrastructure decisions, asset management, donation systems, security frameworks. In practical terms, these are not peripheral matters, they are the very systems through which institutional power operates. In other words, the government rhetorically distances itself from control while simultaneously preserving authority over the mechanism through which real control functions. This is not accidental ambiguity, it is strategic ambiguity. The Union government understands the political sensitivity of temple control. A direct defense of state domination over temples would generate backlash among sections of the Hindu society that increasingly view temple autonomy as part of a broader civilizational assertion. But a complete withdrawal from regulation would create another set of problems. Governments fear corruption scandals, land disputes, financial opacity, factional capture, political patronage networks, and legal chaos if large temple systems suddenly become fully independent without transitional frameworks. As a result, the government attempts to balance two contradicting imperatives. It wants ideological alignment with the demand for religious autonomy while retaining constitutional legitimacy for continued regulatory oversight. This explains why many observers misunderstand what is happening. They assume that political rhetoric automatically translates into institutional transformations, but states rarely surrender administrative power voluntarily, especially when those institutions involve money, land, influence, and mass social legitimacy. And the temples in India are not merely places of worship, they are economic centers, cultural anchors, landholders, social mobilization hubs, political symbols, and sources of enormous public influence. Some temples control assets worth hundreds or thousands of crores, others influence local economies, tourism flows, employment structures, and educational institutions, as well as charitable networks. Control over temple ecosystem therefore carries both symbolic and material significance. This is why the issue cannot be reduced to a simplistic debate between religious freedom and governance interference. The deeper struggle concerns who ultimately controls institutional legitimacy inside a democratic civilization state like India. The Modi government statement before the Supreme Court should therefore be understood not as a revolutionary policy shift but as a sophisticated positioning exercise. It signals sympathy towards temple autonomy without dismantling the legal architecture that permits state regulation. It appeals emotionally to supporters of decentralization while avoiding the risks associated with administrative disengagement. The system itself remains fundamentally intact. No major nationwide framework has been abolished. No sweeping transfer of authority has occurred. No constitutional amendment has removed the state's regulatory power. No Supreme Court ruling has categorically prohibited state involvement in temple administration. Most importantly, because India is a federal structure, state governments retain enormous power over the domain regardless of the union's government rhetoric. This distinction changes everything. The average citizen often imagines the government as a single unified authority, but India's constitutional structure distributes power between the union and the states. Temple administration largely falls within state jurisdiction. This means even if the central government ideologically distances itself from temple control, state governments are not automatically compelled to follow that position unless courts or legislation force the structural changes. Therefore, the real battlefield is not merely political speeches or courtroom rhetoric. The real battlefield lies in constitutional interpretation, state legislation, judicial doctrine, and the deep political question of how India defines the relationship between religion and state power in the 21st century, and the battle is far from over. Part 2: How the Indian state entered temple administration. To understand why the temple control issue became so politically radioactive in the modern Indic sense, one must go far beyond present day party politics and examine the historical evolution of state power over religious institutions. Because the current system didn't emerge overnight, it was built layer by layer across colonial administration, post independence governance, constitutional imperatives, and political incentives. What exists today is not a sudden conspiracy, nor a simple administrative arrangement. It is the result of a long historical accumulation of state authority. Ironically, one of the foundations of modern temple administration in India was laid by the very colonial power that many Indian nationalists later condemned for civilizational interference, the British Empire. In the early phase of British expansion, the East India Company initially avoided deep engagement with Hindu religious institutions. The company's primary objective was revenue extraction and territorial consolidation, not religious administration. British officials feared that direct involvement in native religion systems could trigger unrest. Temples, mosques, monasteries, and religious trusts were therefore often left under local control. But the British gradually encountered a problem common to all expanding states. Wherever wealth, land, legitimacy accumulate, administrative conflict follows. Major temples in India were not merely spiritual centers. Many controlled massive land grants, agricultural revenue systems, donations, jewelry, and social influence. Disputes frequently emerged regarding succession rights, priest authority, endowment management, and allegations of corruption or misappropriation. Pilgrimage centers generate enormous economic activity, and local elites often fought to dominate them. The colonial state increasingly found itself dragged into arbitration and oversight. By the 19th century, the British administration began introducing regulatory system for religious endowments and the temple properties. Initially, the involvement was justified as a mechanism to ensure accountability and prevent misuse of temple wealth. But once administrative machinery enters an institution, it rarely retreats completely. Supervision gradually evolves into governance. This pattern repeated throughout history across civilizations. States often enter institutions under the pretext of stabilization, crisis management, or anti corruption oversight. Over time, temporary intervention becomes normalized authority. The British eventually realized another strategic reality. Religious institutions were not merely cultural spaces, they were nodes of local power. Whoever influences these institutions gains direct influence over society itself. Temples commanded emotional legitimacy among populations in ways colonial bureaucracies never could. Managing access to these institutions therefore became politically valuable. However, colonial involvement in temples also generated criticism. Many Indians viewed it as inappropriate for foreign Christian power to interfere in Hindu religious affairs. Facing pressure, the British gradually attempted to distance itself from overt religious administration while still managing regulatory influence through legal and bureaucratic system. In other words, they sought indirect control rather than visible control. That distinction survives even today. After independence, the newly formed Indian state inherited much of the colonial administrative structure. Independent India didn't begin from a blank state. Bureaucracies, legal frameworks, property records, administrative traditions, and the governance models carried over into the post colonial republic. Many state governments retained and expanded temple oversight systems rather than dismantling them. This decision emerged from multiple motivations. One motivation was ideological. India's post independence leadership embraced a model of secularism fundamentally different from the Western concept. In many Western systems, secularism often implies a sharp institutional separation between church and state. In India, secularism evolved into something more interventionist and managerial. The state didn't completely detach itself from religion. Instead, it positioned itself as a regulator and overseer of religious institutions in the name of social reform, equality, and public administration. That distinction is critical. Indian secularism was built not on total interference but on selective engagement. The state argued that intervention was necessary to address caste discrimination, temple entry restrictions, hereditary monopolies, financial opacity, and institutional corruption. Reformist politics became deeply connected to temple governance. In several regions, especially South India, anti-caste movements and Dravidian political current viewed temple administration as inseparable from broader social political structure. Control over temples therefore became linked to projects of social transformation and political redistribution. This is why temple control debates in states like Tamil Nadu carry a completely different historical tone than they do in North India. In Tamil Nadu, temple administration became entangled with anti-Brahman politics, Dravidian identity movements, social justice narratives, and state-centric governance model. The Hindu religious and charitable endowment departments emerged not merely as financial regulators but as instrument of political restructuring. Over time, this creates a new ecosystem of incentives. Government discouraged that religious institutions represented not only cultural legitimacy but also administrative leverage. Temple boards could influence employment, temple lands could affect real estate and local economics, pilgrimage management affected tourism and infrastructure. Appointments to temple trusts created networks of patronage. Political actors increasingly understood that religious administration could reinforce electoral ecosystems. This is one of the central truths most public often ignore. Institutions are rarely controlled solely by ideological reasons. They are controlled because institutions generate network of influence, bureaucracies, political parties, local elites, contractors, union trustees, and regional power brokers all develop material interests, even administrative systems. Even if governments publicly claim ideological neutrality, institutional ecosystems develop self preservation instincts. Temple administration in India eventually became one such ecosystem. Meanwhile, another parallel narrative was developing within sections of Hindu society. Critics began arguing that the Indian state was applying secularism asymmetrically. They pointed out that while governments heavily regulated many Hindu temples, other religion institutions often retained greater internal autonomy. Over decades, the argument transformed into a powerful political grievances. That grievance was not merely economic, it became psychological and civilizational. Many critics began a deeper question. If India's constitution is secular, why should the state manage the internal institutions of one religious civilization more extensively than others? Why should temple revenues, appointments, and administrations remain subject to political structures while other communities enjoy greater independence? These questions gradually entered mainstream political discourse. The rise of Hindu nationalist politics intensified this transformation. Parties and ideological organizations associated with Hindu civilization and identity increasingly framed temple control as a symbolic of a larger imbalance within the Indian state. The issue evolved beyond administration into a narrative of historical correction. Temple autonomy became associated with reclaiming civilizational confidence and reducing political intrusion into Hindu institutions. However, the situation was never simple enough for clean ideological solutions. Even many critics of state control privately recognize a difficult reality. Major religious institutions are vulnerable to corruption, faction capture, dynastic monopolies, opaque finances, and internal conflict. Complete deregulation could produce entirely new crises. Large temples manage massive donations, lands, gold reserves, educational systems, and social services. Removing all oversight without strong accountability mechanism could create parallel power centers beyond effective public scrutiny. This creates a contradiction that still defines the debate today. One side argues that the state control violates religious autonomy and constitutional fairness. The other side argues the absence of oversight risks corruption, exclusion, and institutional abuse. Governments attempts to balance both narratives simultaneously, which is why they often rely on strategic ambiguity instead of decisive sectoral reform. The Modi government's statement before the Supreme Court must be understood inside this historical continuum. It is not an isolated declaration, it is part of a decades long struggle over how India defines secularism, institutional authority, and religious autonomy. The central government understands that the demand for temple autonomy carries emotional force among significant segments of society, but it also understands that dismantling administrative system built over decades would produce legal, bureaucratic, financial, and political turbulence across multiple states. At the center of the temple control debate lies one of the most important constitutional struggles in modern India, the battle over the meaning of religious freedom itself. The issue is not merely administrative, it has evolved into deeper confrontation between competing visions of the Indian state. One vision sees the state as a neutral regulator with authority to intervene in institutional matters for public welfare and accountability. The other sees religious institutions, especially temples, as civilizational bodies that could possess substantial autonomy free from political management. Article 25 guarantees freedom of conscience and the right to freely profess, practice, and propagate religion. At first glance, this appears absolute, but the provisions immediately introduces limitations. Religious freedom is subjected to public order, morality, health, and other constitutional provisions. Even more importantly, Article 25 oblique 2 explicitly allows the state to regulate secular activities associated with religious practice. Because once a government or court classifies an activity as secular rather than essential religious practice, the state gains constitutional space to regulate it. Over time, Indian courts developed what became known as essential religious practice doctrine. Under this framework, distinguishing judges began distinguishing between practices considered essential to religion and practices viewed as administrative, economic, political, or secular in nature. Governments argues that while denominations may manage religious affairs, legislatures can still regulate administration, finance, and governance structures through properly enacted laws. This interpretation allows states to justify various temporal administration acts across India. Courts repeatedly upheld the idea that the state may supervise secular management while leaving core religious rituals intact. Because critics argue that separating religious from secular functions inside temple ecosystem is often artificial. Temples are not corporations with detachable spiritual departments. In many Hindu traditions, administration itself is deeply connected to religious continuity. Control over donation affects rituals. Control over appointment affects tradition. Control over land affects festival, charities, and priestly systems. Control over infrastructure affects pilgrimage culture. The line between religion and administration is not always clean.